Welcome. Hello, everyone. Get your names down, okay? Glad you can make it. We have an assignment due tonight on Latin American independence, and hopefully you were able to read the other version. It just has a little bit more information that I learned as of late, because some of these I'm writing them as I go along. So let's see here. Get the date down. All right. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments.
Do you know how long the Delta course is?
It this course goes until May 13th.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. You guys, as I said in the message, you guys did very well on your first assignment, like just right off the bat. Very, very keen, intelligent thought employed. I was genuinely impressed. You guys have this down. This is my class is probably a piece of cake. All right, let's see here. Sorry, I'm taking so long. Okay. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and share the page and go over some notes, some basic notes on the Latin American Wars for Independence. Okay. So you have here, right? Um, the Bourbon reforms came about by way of a few Bourbon leaders over Spain from that family, and they called it enlightened despotism. It seems like a strange juxtaposition, like you know an enigma, but at any rate, they wanted to because with the Enlightenment, right? That which is natural in a deistic sense, with deism, that which is natural is that which is best. Okay, so man in his natural state is supposed to be free. And they, according to Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes, even, but that's they didn't carry it that far under the Bourbon reforms, obviously. They wanted enlightened change and they wanted enlightened rule, but not democratic rule and not entailing popular sovereignty and the consent of the governed, right? That authority emanates from the permission of those being governed. They didn't go that far. And so when they brought about these Bourbon reforms, they actually made the political realm less democratic than it already was. You have the intendants, you have the subdelegados, and they took over from governors and alcalde mayores or mayors, etc. And they put an end to the selling of offices. Philip II had been desperate in the 1570s and had begun selling offices to the highest bidders. And many criollos, historically, with having two Spanish parents, were doing fairly well. You know, many of them claim to have come from conquistadores who were handsomely um, rewarded for their services, their military services. And so some of them had, quite a few of them had money. According to Simon Bolivar's biographer, Marie Arana, she contends he was very well to do, as were his ancestors from the first generation over here from Spain. So at any rate, the criollos, they've been able to purchase several positions, and now they're being replaced by intendants and subdelegados. So it was kind of a combustible mixture. Politically, they were being discouraged, and economically, they were being encouraged. They you have you here as you have here, criollos benefited from more open trade. Okay, so they began to relax some of their mercantilist restrictions in the name of enlightened change. And so, what oftentimes happens, right, is when you have a demographic that begins doing better for itself economically, it doesn't take long at all, and they begin to demand political rights to coincide with their economic, improved lifestyles. So, this when they do the Bourbon reforms, it's the beginning of a narrative that's going to contend that the Criollos were led by self-interest, right? That they were encouraged economically, discouraged politically, and so it made them a combustible lot or demographic in Latin America. And there's no doubt that many of the leaders of the Latin American Wars for Independence were Criollos. Okay, so Simon Bolivar, Andres Bello, Francisco de Miranda, and many others in South America. And then, of course, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla up in Mexico. Um, and so Guadalupe, Mariano Guadalupe, and Victoria, and at any rate, several of them. Santa Anna. So Napoleon, he takes Spain, right? And he takes both Charles the Fourth and his son Ferdinand the Seventh, Fernando the Seventh. And so Spain has a political vacuum, right? Because nowhere in Spain, nowhere in Latin America have I read of a single self-appointed or elected body amongst them contending that they recognize Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, Joseph, on placed on the Spanish throne. All right. So when it creates this vacuum, as they say, nature hates a vacuum, and now it's an opportunity. And the Spaniards and the Latin Americans were no dummies. So the word, the parlance of the day was juntas, right? These committees. So Seville contended that it was the true representative of the Spanish people, the junta in Brazil. And then they were militarily dispersed, and then Cadiz did the same. Okay, so like I said, it went from Seville to Cadiz, claiming sovereignty over not only Spain but also Latin America. All right. So they sent people to some of the main cities in Latin America, Cartagena, Caracas, Mexico City, etc. Right? And they tried to uh, get acknowledgement that they were the true representative of the Spanish people for now, right? Until Fernando the Seventh could come back. But according to a book called Americanos, that was a mask by not only many Spaniards, but also by many Latin Americans as well, contending popular sovereignty, right? That they now give permission that they are the source of authority, they the people, and they give their permission when Fernando comes back to acknowledge him as their crown. And of course, if you're familiar with Spanish history, Fernando the Seventh comes in. They at first forced a liberal constitution on him in 1812, and then he's going to do away with that constitution and claim divine right, etc. It's going to make a mess of things. All right. So yeah, you see here, Fernando the Seventh returns, the son. He is forced to acquiesce or to give in to a liberal constitution of 1812. This espoused popular sovereignty. It was for elective, a democratic republic, kind of a constitutional republic with the crown instead of a prime minister. And so, but about 4 years later, he abrogates this, and this gives a chance to people in Latin America to decide are they going to want to follow this man any longer or not. So, about that time, about 4 years later, Simon Bolivar began winning militarily for uh, New Granada, which is Colombia, and Venezuela to become independent. Matter of fact, they declared republics in both future countries and claimed that they were connected by way of a confederation. Okay. So let's see here. So to many people, the mask of Fernando disappeared, if you believe that it was there to begin with. Um, and Bolivar and other Venezuelans stated they wanted independence and no longer under Spain, nor under Spain's monarch Fernando VII. Okay. And then fast forward to 1820, liberals forced Fernando VII back in Spain to return to the liberal constitution of 1812. And so then at that time, conservatives like Agustin de Iturbide in Mexico, they don't want to live under a liberal Spain. So it's kind of ironic, right? They were not led by Enlightenment rhetoric from the French Enlightenment of the 1740s, nor the Scottish Libertarian Enlightenment about that time as well, but instead by kind of uber conservative ideology. They did not want a liberal Spain. And so Iturbide is going to sue for peace and an armistice with the liberals. So as they have here, ironically, conservatives and regressives, those who want to go backwards in time, want Mexico to be independent, no longer just the liberals. Okay. So with the liberals, remember, the Spaniards were the first to employ that term from the classical liberal movement that was going on in the 19th century under writers like John Stuart Mill. His famous book On Liberty is what it's titled. Individual rights, individual autonomy, political participation by the people in government, etc. Free trade, capitalism. So in Mexico, both conservatives and liberals won independence for different reasons. Conservatives had more military power, hence, Mexico's Constitution of Three Guarantees was quite conservative. Okay, so the three guarantees, right, were Roman Catholic official church, a constitutional monarchy. So, at least in theory, the Constitution is the source of authority, not the monarch, right? This is the beginning of the sway that you see in English Whig history that the English are so proud of, where Parliament and the Constitution are going to reign supreme over the monarch. So, a constitutional monarchy, and then, of course, equality entre or between los peninsulares, those from the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, and the Criollos, the Spaniards in America. So for 3 years, Agustin de Iturbide declares himself Emperor Agustin el Primero, right? Emperor Augustine the First. And so this doesn't last. There is a coup, if not something approximating a revolution, in 1824, and they put together in 1824 a constitutional federal republic. Does that sound familiar? That's what we have here in the US. Right? So let's see here. Similarities with the narratives of US independence. First of all, Criollos and the founding fathers, there's evidence that they were led, at least partially, at least by some history writers, self-interest in kicking out the top echelon, knowing that they were number two. They were the second echelon, and they would be the top dog standing if they kicked out the British and the Spanish, respectively. Okay. But both also claim to have been influenced by the Enlightenment. All right. And remember with the Enlightenment, right? Um, once you not only have the consent of the governed with Rousseau and Locke, right? You you uh, you have natural rights, right? The rights that you're entitled to by nature of being a human being and being born, period. And so, at any rate, with this notion of natural rights, you have the right to protest peacefully. Under largely, you could find the writings of Voltaire that kind of coincide with that, Voltaire. And then you have You have the right to self-cultivation, to rise by merit, and to have access to education, access to learn a trade, and try to become as wealthy and successful as you can. That arguably is Diderot and Condorcet, the gentleman who wrote the French encyclopedias. They were all about that. And I personally think that's what Jefferson was alluding to, those two gentlemen, when he said the pursuit of happiness. Okay. You also have a notion of checks on power, not only the French Enlightenment, but the Scottish Enlightenment as well. With the French Enlightenment, you have Montesquieu, right? And Montesquieu is for checks and balances. Let's see here. Natural rights, life, liberty, property. And property was to benefit from the sweat of your own labor. Okay, it's a sense of equity, of fairness. Life, liberty, property, self-cultivation, expression. Like I said, with the self-cultivation, I would say it's Diderot and Condorcet. With expression, I would definitely mention Voltaire. Life, liberty, and property, of course, John Locke in his second treatise on government, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau on his book called The Social Contract. Okay.
You're,
Yeah, someone have a comment or question?
no, it's just agreeing.
Oh,
How
okay.
you, yeah, it's just how you always say okay.
Sorry. Yeah, so at any rate, right? Human beings, as a lot of people would say, human beings are complex, right? They can be led by self-interest and idealism simultaneously, right? And with me, right, idealism is just after your ideology determines that which is wrong or inequitable or unfair about life, your idealism provides you with the motive and the parameters to um, fix such, right? So you want to improve man and you want to improve mankind's institutions if you're idealistic, okay? And then, of course, right, with pragmatism is you display a practical oriented desire for simply results. Okay, so sometimes, right, people express that they kind of hint that idealism and pragmatism are kind of antithetical to each other. They're kind of opposite. Okay, so going back to this handout, what I try to contend, right, is what do we know, right? What do we know from this handout and some of the basic narratives on Latin American independence? Well, for one, we know that, Mexico, when it first became independent, and then eventually South America, uh, ended up with quite, in some ways, conservative governments, okay, in conserving tradition and status quo. Um, uh, but I contend that it wasn't that Latin Americans are inherently more conservative than Norte Americanos, than, like, white English stock uh, Americans from the future U.S. Um, but in fact, I try to make the contention that if anything, they were more idealistic than the founding fathers were. But, right, the big exception here, caveat, is that they ran into certain problems and issues and obstacles that seemed to them to be quite insurmountable. And so then, in the face of those obstacles, leaders like Simon Bolivar decided to take a pragmatic route. And you could almost say that they felt compelled to take a pragmatic route instead of idealistic one. Excuse me. So I give them credit for intention, and I'm kind of defending Latin American leaders of independence, right? And saying that they wanted to be idealistic, but they literally felt like they couldn't. Okay. So you find idealism with Miguel Hidalgo and Father Morelos after him, right? Who fought under him and after him. Both priests were highly, especially Hidalgo, were well read in the Enlightenment, in the works of the Enlightenment. They had banned books from Voltaire and Rousseau, etc., from the Spanish Inquisition. They had salons, right? And the salons were like these intellectual coffee houses, whereby you would have debate and discourse on different Enlightenment works that everyone in the club had read. And so you had that going on. Father Hidalgo hosted such secretly, and in some ways not so secretly. You also have, what do they call for? Well, you could look at Chilpancingo, the name of that town, and Father Morelos kind of put on paper what he thought Hidalgo intended to bring about. And so, for one, right, they put an end to slavery. They put an end to Native American tribute. They put an end to the caste system so that there be equality, political equality amongst men of all colors and stripes and ethnic backgrounds and pigment of skin. Okay. That's progressive. That's way ahead of the founding fathers. All right. They also were for limited property redistribution, whereby Native American and Pardo or mixed blood sharecropper farmers who rented from the owner would be granted entitlement and ownership of the land that they farmed. And not to mention also, uh, you could also say that Miguel Hidalgo dabbled with something that was kind of a pre-Marxism under a guy named Fourier, Fourier. Fourier was for what the Marxists would later call syndicalism, Syndicalism, whereby the people, the working class laborers in a certain area democratically decide on how to allocate resources and wealth. Okay. So they were quite progressive. They were quite radical, you could even say, for the 1800s, these two priests. But what happened is they lost. Militarily, they lost. All right. And they were both executed. So then move down to South America, and you got Simon Bolivar. Um, he had um, he had Samuel Rodriguez, his tutor, and another tutor as well, another Venezuelan. I can't recall his name, but it's in here in the handout. And they acquainted him with the classics, the Greco-Roman classics, and he loved, for instance, Plutarch. And Plutarch, right? Um, Plutarch was very much for civic virtue, putting your own selfish needs that your faction that you belong to, the group that shares the same self-interest, you put that aside and you do what's best for the community itself, for the general welfare. You rule abstemiously, uh, uh, right? Where you don't want luxury and lots of goods and so forth, and you don't want to be paid handsomely. You do your selfless service because it's the right thing to do. And of course, right, you behave in a way that is for the welfare, including the limited participation of the common people, the demos, the people, from which we get the term democracy. Um, so at any rate, he very much was into Plutarch. He very much was into Rousseau and the social contract. I remember with Rousseau, once mankind gives his permission for government to rule as his servant, not as master, and to protect his natural rights, he not only has the right of revolution if that government fails to do its job in protecting natural rights, but he also contended that, a little bit vaguely, that people are to follow the general will. That was his term translated from French, the general will. And is that simply the will of the majority? Perhaps, but I don't know. I've read both. I've read interpretations as such and interpretations that were against that notion. But whatever it was, right, it clearly entailed civic virtue. It clearly entailed communalism, right, with everyone together. So at any rate, um, he reads such works. And he goes to a particular mountainside in Rome where it was historically significant. And he makes a promise that he is going to institute an enlightened republic in his home country of Venezuela. All right. So he comes back, and boy, does he try. The expression, the third time's a charm. Well, with Simon Bolivar, the fifth time was a charm. This poor guy tried 4 times and failed before succeeding. He fought for over a decade. All right. But after his fourth failure, or it might have been his third, um, he went to Jamaica and he wrote his famous Jamaica letters. And you could feel from the tone that he's a broken man by this time. And he states, right? He states the Norte Americanos up in the US, he said they had it so much easier than we do. He said, first of all, they were more of a monolithic bunch, that it was basically a revolution for white males, right? Because they didn't tackle the issue of Native Americans, African Americans in slavery, etc. Women's rights, no way. So he said, they had much more unity and being such a narrow conglomeration of demographics. And he says they also, under the British, had had some history of self-government, limitedly, but self-government nevertheless. And he says, I look at my Spaniards and my Pardos here in Latin America, and he says, Spain has not allowed us to participate politically. Spain has kept us under the old Ancien regime, as they called it, the old world before the Enlightenment and before the French Revolution. Okay, of privilege and deference. Deference is knowing your place and submitting to your superiors, etc., right? So he says, my Latin American people are not ready for self-government. They haven't been prepared in any way for it. And they're nowhere near egalitarian, putting everyone on equal footing. But they're accustomed to the Spanish hierarchy, to the pigmentocracy, etc. And then speaking of pigmentocracy, right? He says, my people here are very, very much divided ideologically as well as ethnically. Okay. Ideologically, you had people arguably that were very progressive, liberal, enlightened, etc. And you had those who were uber conservative, who wanted to have an emperor and a privileged aristocracy and a mercantilist economy, etc. And you didn't have that broad of a gap amongst the Norte Americanos, arguably. So not only are they split ideologically in Latin America, not only are they supposedly not accustomed to self-government, but they also are very jealous and suspicious of one another ethnically. Okay. So take, for instance, the legions of hell, right? That's what they were called, translated to English, under a guy named Tomas Boves, Boves. The legions of hell were llaneros. The llaneros were men of the open plains of Argentina and Chile. Llaneros, and most of them, right, were people of color, either indigenous or African or both. So these llaneros, right, they began fighting for themselves. The crown asked them to fight for them. And they said, no, thank you. The rebels wanting independence asked them to fight with them. They said, no, thank you. All right. And then in limited times, they were somewhat, you could almost cynically say, bribed. Um, first by first by the Spanish crown, and then by um, the insurgents who wanted freedom. And you could easily guess how the manner by which they were bribed is they contended no more tribute, no more slavery, and political equality of all men. Right? So, but they were a tough lot. They were a tough lot to win over. Because leading to the last factor that he mentioned, the last variable is regionalism. A lot of this supposedly is geography, as well as traditions, customs, okay, uh, political exclusion, etc. That one region after another, they refuse to cooperate with one another. So, for instance, the New Granada, they'll be renamed Gran Colombia soon. They wanted no connections with anybody outside Colombia, and they had to be pretty much bribed. And for a limited time, they set a union up with Venezuela, nearby Venezuela, and they okayed their leader to go down and try to pacify and win over both Chile and Peru. All right. But once they did, Chile and Peru did not want to be told what to do by this newly elected Congress in Colombia. So Simon Bolivar, right, and hence as you see a pre, a warning to this in his Jamaica letters, he comes and he says, you know what, Rousseau is not going to be proud of me, but Latin America, South America needs to temporarily be led by an iron hand. All right. So he makes himself a liberator and dictator over Venezuela. All right. He shows up in Peru and they form a government, and he refuses to relinquish his sword. Because remember with George Washington, he symbolically gave up surrendered his sword, saying, right, that I'm not going to be like Julius Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon and turned his army on his own political rivals in his own country, right, for political ends. So he says, I'm gonna submit to civilian control. Simon Bolivar did not. Now, according to this book, right, Simon Bolivar was well aware of the hypocrisy of that. in light of, what he had read of Rousseau and others. But he contended, right, that he didn't have much of a choice. That Latin Americans were too disunited. It was too chaotic. And let's face it, right? They had a much bigger task than the Norte Americanos because they were including men of all ethnic backgrounds and all color of skin. All right. So anybody have any questions or comments?
No.
Okay, thank you.
None.
All right. So always feel free, you guys. If you have anything to say, I'd love to hear it. But no pressure. You don't have to. Um, and then keep in mind the American handout. You have a guy named Bernard Bailyn, and he said that the Norte Americanos up in the US were highly idealistic. They were highly influenced by the French and Scottish Enlightenments. He said the literati or the intelligentsia, the leading intellectuals of America, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, that they imbibed these Enlightenment works and that they pretty much summarized them in their propaganda, in their rhetoric, so that the average person in America became familiar with the notion of natural rights, the social contract, consent of the governed, checks and balances, etc. But they're not in agreement, of course. Other historians like Howard Zinn and Joseph Ellis said, no, look at the founding fathers. They are not a mini example or microcosm of their population. These dudes saw themselves as the cream of the crop. I mean, after all, right? The Constitutional Convention, what was the most common career amongst the 55 delegates? Lawyer. Lawyers constituted less than 1% of the population. The majority of them were college educated. Again, those who were college educated constituted about 1% of the population at large. Joseph Ellis's section number 3 in that handout, he shows how people like George Washington were highly ambitious and their ambitions were not being met. They were being thwarted by the British leaders and the British system. So hence they had a personal axe to grind. And then, of course, Zinn, the last section on that handout that I asked you to read, if you would, he even has a more cynical view, right? Whereby he contends that the founding fathers manipulated the masses with propaganda about enlightenment to get them to fight with and for them. And of course, they conveniently used the British as a scapegoat for all the poor's wrath and anger and injustices that they suffered, so that they could be the top dog standing once the British left. All right. So there are, many different interpretations to the American War for Independence and whether it truly constituted a, quote, revolution or not. And you also keep in mind that we tried a democratic confederation for 4 years at the end of the war, and it failed miserably. And they devised what some people would consider a quite relatively, compared to that one, that first failed government, a quite conservative federal republic that gave a lot more power to the central government, Congress in particular, but also the chief executive, the president, an unelected Supreme Court, handpicked, right? And that's what a republic is, though, right? I stick with the simple definition of Aristotle that a republic has elements of democracy, right? Ruled by the demos, the people, has elements of an aristocracy, aristoi meaning the best, so the well educated, etc., not directly elected into office. And then obviously elements of a monarchy, of a chief executive over the government as well. Clearly, one part that was not uber conservative in the Constitution was the federal part of sharing power with the states and also the checks and balances, right, that Montesquieu would have wanted in our system. But what was not progressive, enlightened, classically liberal was the endorsement of slavery, the marginalization of Native Americans, and also the failure to declare universal citizenship. So you can make the argument that our founding fathers were not that idealistic. But in this piece, I'm defending the Latin Americans, contending that many of their leaders were quite idealistic, but they just facing, as we have here, factionalism, regionalism, the issues of different ethnicities that they felt like they could not live up to their creeds, their rhetoric, what they preached.
Would you say it's good to be idealistic?
Yeah, I would say that I'll say at least this, right? Is that amongst historians, when they contend that someone is idealistic, because you have a negative connotation that idealistic could be a bit naive about humanity and the extent to which you can improve humanity, and also naive about the methods that you use. Because a lot of times, right, people that are idealistic, they're not only idealistic in their goals, right, and what they want to achieve, but they're idealistic also in their endeavors, in the manner by which they get there. So when I think of idealistic, I think of Martin Luther King Jr., right? But
Wait,
you always have cynics. I'll never forget a biographical movie made of him, and I've yet to come across this quote, so I think it was a liberty that the producer of the movie took. But from other things that I've read, it didn't seem too out of character for Malcolm X. But Malcolm X looks at Martin Luther King, smiles and shakes his head and says, "You're a glorious fool."
So I so historians basically categorize idealistic people as like better, no? That's what you're trying to state?
That's right.
Because
That's right.
yeah.
So historians, yeah, thank you for getting me back on track. Historians contend that idealism is a wonderful thing.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Is idealism kind of being like the same thing as being a progressive?
yeah. To me, right, progressive to me, I have a mo much more narrow definition myself for progressive, and that is just forward-looking. Whatever is at the avant-garde, at the very forefront of modern changes, that you embrace and you take on and embrace. To me, that's how I subjectively define progressive. So, you could have had in extreme cases, right, a very far right, far to the right conservative movement, like let's say with Reagan or something in the 1980s, the beginning of the 1980s, and it becomes in vogue. And then technically you could say that you're very conservative, but also progressive, because this neo-conservative movement was just happened to be the new thing at the time. You know what I mean? So that's me at
Yeah.
least.
That makes sense.
So yeah, and when I say progressive in this instance, right, they are much more synonymous with each other because that which was progressive was enlightened, right? Because this was the era of the Enlightenment. So idealistic and progressive went kind of hand in hand. but they necessarily don't always do that.
Okay, thank you.
No, no problem. I love when you guys talk and or have questions. That's great. All right. And so that's just my 2 cents. I think that the Latin American leaders deserve more credit than that. Because the Americans, what they simply did is they resorted to essentialism, right? And with essentialism, you're adhering to supposedly innate qualities of certain demographics, and at that point, you're playing with stereotypes. You're prejudging, and you're assigning stereotypes to people that are supposedly innate, that they're born with it. So that's what they did at the time, is they said, "Oh, these Latin Americans, these people of Spanish blood, they're too passionate. They lack self-control. That's why they have all these coups and civil wars, and that's why their leaders like Simon Bolivar will not relinquish their sword, and they have this thirst and greed for power, right? That it's in their blood." And of course, today in academia, we don't we don't put any stock in essentialism. It's it it's seen as downright passe and even silly. So what I'm just simply saying, right, in defending the Latin American leaders is that it was circumstantial, that the circumstances almost compelled people like Simon Bolivar to no longer live up to their enlightened ideals, and to turn pragmatic and practically apply methods that they felt were necessary to for results. And of course, for him, right, the result was to have an independent and a somewhat unified Venezuela in South America, with a semblance of continuity and law and order. All right. So that's my 2 cents, guys. That's about it for this assignment. If anybody else has a comment or question, by all means, please feel free, as always.
Back to when you said lawyers make up like 1%. What
Uh-huh.
did you mean by that? Like,
I mean, just literally when you do the demographics at that time, um, they you had a couple Ivy League schools, and you had the University of Virginia at that time, as it was simply known, at very few colleges or universities, and extremely selective in the number of applicants that went there. So for most people, right, of working class origin, it was not even remotely feasible to have you or your son or daughter become college educated.
so technically, it would only be like available for higher like positions.
Absolutely.
So then, I feel like that quite played a role in why there weren't many lawyers.
Yes. Like I said, I think that's a valid, even if you don't adhere to the complete cynicism of some of those historians. The first guy, right, who became famous for doing that, Aaliyah, was Charles Beard, like a beard as if the beard that a man wears on his face. If you look up Charles Beard, um, he he just delved into the background of each of the founding fathers, and he implied, right, that it was a very elitist group with its own uh, economic self-interests in mind.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so feel free to look further into that on your own. As I myself, uh, being reminded of him by what you just said and asked, uh, I've always intended to delve deeper into it myself, and I haven't yet. I'd like to. But yeah,
I
Charles
would.
Beard.
Oh, sorry. What was the? You mentioned the poem. I forgot about it. It was a long time ago. You mentioned a poem about this. It was I'm not sure. I don't remember the name, but it was a poem. I read
Oh,
it. It's very confusing to
was
me.
it the poem Yo Soy Joaquin?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that is Rodolfo, known as Corky Gonzalez. Um, Soy Joaquin. Yeah, by
Yeah.
all means, look that poem up. It's great. It's it's rich.
Yeah. I read it. It was kind of confusing because I'm not very good at interpreting, but I did kind of enjoy it.
Good. I'm not either. I'm not either, really. I don't pretend to understand that entire poem. I don't. But
Thank you.
enough of it that it's very interesting, very thought-provoking. All
Thank you.
right. So are you guys doing okay? Everything's going okay as far as you're accustomed to my schedule. Of you got 4 days to do an assignment, 4 weekdays, and then 3 weekdays, then four, then three.
Also, I heard dual enrollment's being turned into a seventh period. Do you know anything about that?
Oh no, I don't. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.
Wait, huh? The seventh period? What?
Yeah, they're saying that they're gonna turn it into a seventh period, so you'll have a whole class to do your dual enrollment work, but you won't be able to do like any extracurriculars or
Wait,
like
that's
Is this?
for
Yeah. Yeah.
next
like
year?
yeah, I'm
Oh,
pretty
okay.
sure.
Thank God. Thank God.
That's I'm gonna ask my counselor on that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry that I know nothing of that.
It's not your fault. Thank you though.
Yeah. Uh-huh. All right, guys. So if you don't have any more comments or questions, I'll probably let you go. But again, I don't need to say this. I really appreciate this class. I like this class. You guys are very earnest and serious about, trying to learn this content. And it in turn has me doing my best to learn new material and to rewrite some of these and so forth. I hope some of it is useful and interesting for you.
I appreciate that.
No, I appreciate you guys. I really do. So thank you, okay? And I will I'll see you next week.
I'll see you next week too.
Yep. See you next week.
All right,
Bye.
you
Have a good
guys take
day.
care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Cowell.
Yeah,
Um, Real quick, I do want to go back to what you said about essentialism.
sure.
Um, so from my understanding, what you said is like essentialism, like those who stood in essentialism would be like they look at like the Latin American leaders and be like, oh, they're like too like crazy or like too passionate about it and things like that. Like, is
Sure.
that basically like kind of what they said about essentialism? Like those who stood in essentialism, is that what they would like say about the Latin leaders? Like they were like too like passionate about it, from my understanding.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Carlos. So what exactly is your question, bud?
Yeah. I just want like I just wanted to see if my understanding of it was correct. Like those who stood in
Yes.
essentialism would see the Latin leaders as like too passionate.
Yes, I believe it is from what you just described to me at this moment. Like I said, it's ascribing a set of characteristics about an entire demographic of people and claiming that those characteristics are innately in their DNA, so that they're almost, you know, incorrigible, that they can't be corrected.
Okay. All right. That is all. Thank you.
No problem. All right. All right. You guys have a good weekend, okay?
You too.
You too.
Thank you.